Welcome everybody, glad you could join us. The theme today is on energy transition. Energy transition is well underway. Renewables are becoming more cost effective and prevalent, and what we're seeing also is green hydrogen coming in as part of this transition, and options in terms of how it will enter that transition still being explored, but potential benefits that could make it a key part of the future energy mix. By way of introduction, I'm your host for today, Richard Lappin. I'm Power Generation Technical Director at WSP in the Middle East, and I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Theobald, Energy Transition Director at WSP UK. Mike, if you want to say hello to everyone.
Yeah, good day to everybody, and I'm glad to be a part of this podcast.
Great. So let's get into it. In this episode of our Anticipate podcast, we'll discuss implications for the current energy transition, explore whether green hydrogen is going to be a major part of a more sustainable future energy mix, and some of the issues that centre around that. Mike, as Director for Energy Transition in the UK, you've obviously and undoubtedly seen the progressive shift towards renewables over the last 10 years. From a UK perspective, what form is this transition taking, and what do you see as the driver or drivers behind the transition?
We've got a long way to go still, and we've already come a considerable way in certain people's minds and to a certain extent behaviours. The energy transition really started quite a few years ago. We had a predominance of coal-fired power stations and oil-fired power stations. They've largely been removed from the energy mix. I think with the latest auctions, we're seeing the coal-fired power stations really having their last gasp. We've still got a long way to go, but we're already, we're setting out our plans. It started in the UK, from a UK perspective, really like lots of other areas with onshore wind and solar. The onshore wind sector is still there, and there's still quite a lot happening. But the big growth areas now are moving towards offshore wind. But the key thing for the energy transition is it's going to mean very different things to many regions. So each region will have their own way of maximising their own resources and availability of renewable power and renewable energy that makes best sense for their economy. So you can't really look at UK and I as a model for everywhere. The Middle East will have a very different model for reaching their targets as well.
Yeah, and presumably the choice of the form of renewable energy is going to be dependent on prevailing meteorological conditions, access to technology. But what role might existing infrastructure play, and what are other influences that might drive the technology choice?
Going back sort of over the last few centuries, really, the industrial revolution, and that took effect over many decades. What we're seeing here is an energy revolution, and it's being driven by the climate that we're seeing in front of us, driving the need to move very rapidly. From an existing infrastructure perspective, we have to use that existing infrastructure as best as we possibly can. There's already a lot of carbon sunk into that existing infrastructure. So the way that I tend to think about this is that if we can make use of that existing infrastructure in the best way possible, then we are going to inherently save carbon in doing so. If we look at the hydrogen cycle, and it's obviously in the ascendancy at the moment, that is going to need a huge amount of infrastructure, both in generating hydrogen and distributing hydrogen to the off-takers. And that may make perfect sense in some areas for some industries and some off-take sectors, but in others it may make less sense in doing so. If we focus on the blue hydrogen, for instance, there's the potential there with the blue hydrogen cycle to reuse a significant amount of the existing infrastructure. We've got gas pipelines in place, and a lot of the gas pipelines at the grid scale have been built with hydrogen in mind for quite some time. But it's when we get further out into the non-industrial areas where we're going to really struggle with hydrogen distribution. For some areas, using existing infrastructure such as the gas pipelines and converting gas pipelines where necessary to be able to handle gas is going to be the sensible move. But it's going to be a much more, even within the UK, it's going to be much more of a regionalised cluster approach to reuse of existing infrastructure. Hydrogen as well as an energy storage and energy transport tool is not going to be as an efficient way forwards for some sectors and some offtakes than others. if we look at using green hydrogen for transport, it has to go through quite a lot of conversion processes to get to the transport. If we use the excess wind, or we use excess wind power to generate hydrogen through the use of electrolysis, we're converting from electricity to hydrogen. Then we have to transport that hydrogen to a regional storage facility, whether that's small or large. It goes into a fuel cell, and then that fuel cell then converts it back into electricity, which then is used for the electric vehicle. So there's quite a lot of inefficient energy transfer processes in place to allow that to happen, which may not be the most effective use for hydrogen. So it's quite a complex issue. I think what we have to do is we have to take the view, where is the original energy coming from, whether it's offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and how can we best use that energy for the off-taker requirements, whether it's EVs, whether it's for industrial heating, whether it's for domestic heating, or for power generation, or further power generation.
Okay, and what about the grid infrastructure? I mean, I presume, but just my view, and I'd like to hear your view. I presume that's what's going to be necessary in the future, because you're going to have a raft of spinning reserve required, is a more integrated grid structures in countries whereby maybe to date the grid structures are connected, but connected with minimal capacity transfer. How do you see that?
Energy trading is definitely going to play an increasingly important part of neighbouring regions' energy mix. There's a lot of discussion about taking solar power from one region via interconnectors and transporting it to the next. There's a lot of balancing needed. There's a lot of peak and troughs to fill. But the more dispersed the areas are, the more chance there is for regions that aren't necessarily sunny at a particular point in time can benefit through that interconnectivity with other regions. And it's the same for things like offshore wind. There has been a big build out of offshore wind in the North Sea around the UK. The difficulty with that, and which is why we're now seeing offshore wind develop into much wider geographic areas, is that when it's less windy in the North Sea, it's probably going to be windier elsewhere. So the more you can geographically separate the renewable sources and use connectivity to transfer energy around, and hence energy trading and energy transfer, the more available energy will be to a greater area, and probably lessen the need to have energy storage. As an interim, energy storage is the way we have to go, because it's going to take a long time to build out all of that new infrastructure to support that. So things like conventional battery storage, pump storage, these technologies will need to be developed to support the next 10 years of renewable generation.
And in terms of storage, is it going to be fuel cell? I mean, you mentioned the conventional sort of pump storage that traditionally supported nuclear power generation. But in the future, are we going to see more fuel cell battery storage, or what's the form of storage for the future?
I think it's going to be quite complex and varied. It was very easy in the more recent past when power generation was predicated on the extractive industries of oil and gas for power. We can pretty much turn things on and turn them off at will. We're no longer in that zone. Therefore, we're going to have to take a much more deeper dive. We're going to have to evaluate what type of storage is probably the most beneficial for even regions within the UK and regions within other parts of countries, because what will make sense, say, for the north of the UK will not make sense for the south of the UK, and likewise that's going to be the same for lots of other regions. We're seeing a huge growth in traditional battery storage. I think the chemistry is probably going to change. There has been a big ramp up based upon lithium-ion technology, but that may not be the most prevalent battery chemistry emerging over the next few years. Battery chemistry technology is evolving extremely quickly, and the ability to store energy per unit is reducing in size. One of the conundrums with battery storage is that what may be good for our mobile phones may not be good for grid scale battery storage in terms of chemistry. You've got very different drivers. In a mobile phone, you need to have a battery that will be light and compact. Whereas if you've got a battery storage system on an industrial zone, being light and compact is not necessarily the key driver. The world will respond to the value chain will respond to the emerging technologies.
And presumably longevity plays a huge role in all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, just going back a second to hydrogen. You mentioned hydrogen. What we're seeing, certainly in the Middle East, is we're seeing a trend towards export of hydrogen-related products such as ammonia. How do you actually see that? Because you mentioned in terms of moving hydrogen around, you need to make a number of conversions. And it just seems to be, again, that you've got electrolysis, you've got the conversion to ammonia, and then you've got to take the hydrogen out of the ammonia wherever it's being dispatched to. In between time, you've got the need to store, and you've got the issues with regard to logistics in terms of shipping. It just seems an expensive process.
Well, I think anything to do with hydrogen is not going to be around the same cost as what we've typically seen energy to cost. We need to reset our expectations on what the value of energy actually is. Whereas before, we moved into a completely different paradigm now. We were able to use the atmosphere as as generally a trash can for CO2 and other emissions. We're now valuing that our environment. We're now valuing our atmosphere, which we all breathe, to have a value in itself. And we've chosen, because the climate is forcing us to choose, to not discharge into the atmosphere to any level near where we have done in the past. And therefore, there's a cost associated with that. So, if when we look at the terms of inefficiencies, and it's very costly, and it's costs that we've been used to predicating on the free use of our atmosphere to absorb what is actually quite a costly process to tackle. I think generally, unfortunately, we are going to have to get used to much higher energy costs, because the ease of access to energy for whatever purpose and whatever offtake is going to be less. So in other words, it's going to be harder for us to gain access to that energy for what we need to use the energy for, and that is going to mean a cost. Although hydrogen is in the ascendancy, it is not going to be without its problems. It's not going to be without the inefficiencies, but it might just be that's what we have to do to get us to the place we need to be at.
I see also that a move towards trying to have bus fleets, for example, run on hydrogen. And again, the question that surfaces to me is hydrogen really going to play a role in the future transport energy demand, or basically have electric vehicles already taken and stepped into that spotlight?
It's very hard to hedge against batteries now being able to cement their position in the transport infrastructure. A lot of it's going to be down to how fast the different battery chemistries will go beyond proof of concept to a scalable solution. The move towards solid state batteries, for instance, is expecting to triple, quadruple the energy storage capacity of batteries that you recognize in any electric vehicle today. So you can either go 4 times longer, or you can have a battery that's 4 times smaller. These are things that are on they're moving from lab scale into early stage ramp up scale technologies. I wouldn't be surprised in 2 or 3 years we'll see a significant volume of solid state batteries starting to move into the market. Whereas hydrogen is in many ways a mature technology. We know that any given size of electrolyzer, you'll get so much hydrogen out of it. Okay, there may be some improvement in catalysts and things like that, but the development of the hydrogen technology is well known, and it comes with I think the efficiencies are going to be more hard fought for. It's good to see that we have been evaluating and rolling out hydrogen into many different areas, and some of those will still going back to the theme that it's not going to be a single answer, or it's going to be quite a complex answer to get us to where we need to get to. hydrogen will still have its part to play. So although hydrogen may not make it to a large embedded state within the transport infrastructure, it will have its place to play in industrial sectors that require a lot of heat. I'm thinking of the steel industry that does have a high heat demand, and I can see there being a benefit to switch from gas to a hydrogen fuel source for those industries because it makes much better sense.
And with regard to the general shift to renewables, obviously that you mentioned earlier, it's going to have some impact on energy prices, and we're going to get used to paying more for energy potentially. Are there any mitigants in that regard, or is it just going to be the only mitigant going to be the scale at which they're introduced, or is there anything else that can be done to minimize pricing?
Ultimately, the price of energy is going to always trickle down to the consumer, because it's the consumer that needs the energy. Now, the governments can subsidise to a certain level, but ultimately that subsidy needs to come from somewhere. In terms of the cost of energy increasing, yes, it is going to be more costly for energy over the sort of 10 to 15 year period. But the expectation is once we have, and it's mainly due to building all this additional infrastructure that we're going to have to build to meet our targets. There is an expectation that once that build out of infrastructure becomes mature and there's the energy mix has moved to a much higher level of renewable energy, the energy prices will start to come down again. It's going to take quite a while to see that start to play out in consumers and in industrial sort of energy bills.
Okay, and from a future perspective, do you actually see renewables being the majority component in the energy generation mix for countries, or is it going to still be a sort of 20 to 30% niche?
I fully anticipate that the end point for the energy transition will be predominantly renewable based, or at least an abated place, so that where we do have CO2 emitting technologies, that the CO2 is abated by carbon capture. But it's going to be very different. The needs of Africa are very different to the needs of the UK, which are very different to the needs of the Middle East. And the ability for those regions to adopt certain technologies is going to be very different as well. The 20-year outlook, we are still going to see gas play a significant part of the energy mix globally. We are anticipating for that the gas-fired power stations and other users of gas to go through CO2 abatement via carbon capture and sequestration, so that the net effect of that energy or that power generation will be similar to a renewable source.
Just in terms of that, obviously if abatement comes in and it's as clean as a renewable generator, for want of a better characterization, then of course you'd expect that production of gas turbines, etc., will still continue. But are we going to see in that regard, given that in order to consider a gas turbine, you need to put a whole raft of abatement on the back end of it, and there's a cost associated with that itself will mean that the fossil-fired generation from gas becomes then relatively small component of a generation mix?
Yeah, so we're starting to talk about cost again, and we cannot ignore what we have been ignoring for decades, ever since the Industrial Revolution. That we can't ignore the cost of the atmosphere. But there are other technologies coming on. So we have been working with 8 Rivers substantially over the last 8 years. As one example of a technology where you'll actually get inherent CO2 capture within the process for lower capital cost. So I think there are more answers out there than carrying on with the gas-fired power generation and building a carbon capture facility next to it for then onward CO2 pipeline out to a sequestration zone. There are more technologies. Equally, that's one developing technology built on the alum for vet cycle. Similarly, nuclear fusion is another technology that is rapidly advancing. It has been, forever it's been 15 years away or 20 years away. We're now moving to a position where, we have proof of concept and early stage, pilot plants expected to be the final step before commercially sized facilities.
I was going to say, I remember being in a conversation 20 years ago with Stephen King, and he was saying at the time that fusion energy was 40 years away, and that was about 20 years ago. So
yeah, okay.
The time frame doesn't seem to change, but I never see the technology emerging.
Yeah, but we've now got very well-funded campaigns with pilot plants that are being built even in the UK in Culham that are showing, and there's very different concepts, of course, being explored in this. But there's been a huge ramp up in expectation and also achievements in the last 2 years for nuclear fusion. The real expectation is this. We're not talking about 15 to 20 years away. We're talking about 2 years away before we start to see funding starting to flow into commercially sized facilities.
Great, Mike. Thanks very much for the podcast today. I really enjoyed the chat. To our listeners, thanks for listening all the way through. Please leave a comment if today's discussion sparked your interest, or if there are any burning issues that you think we didn't address during our discussions. And don't forget to join us 2 weeks hence for the next podcast. Thank you very much.